What's up, Fathom Church, and welcome to the Going Deeper podcast. We are here with Karina Bost. Hello, Karina.
Hey, hey.
And lead pastor Chris Martin. Hey, Chris.
Bonjour.
Oh, we're back to French again. That's great.
Very French. Yeah.
You know what's funny is, right as you said that, I've got your raccoon over your shoulder that I see. That just,
Well, this
now
is
he's
a
a
fancy,
French raccoon.
This is a fancy podcast.
It
La
is
raccoon.
not.
Bentley.
El raccoon.
This
Bentley
is
the raccoon.
This is anything but a fancy podcast.
What?
But hey, welcome to our podcast. Hey, this week we're going to be talking a little bit, kind of sort of what we did a few weeks ago, and diving a little bit deeper into the sermon that we just heard this past Sunday. So whenever you're listening to this, we are still in our First Timothy series. This past Sunday, we heard from one of our elders, Eric Shelley, and he talked about First Timothy chapter 3, verses 8 through 13, which was really on deacons, and this role of deacons in the church. And so we're kind of going to unpack that a little bit more. And we've got us three sitting here, and we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like in the sense of working in a church, and kind of what happens when you maybe like first get a job at a church, the differences between, you know, working at a normal job and working at a church that you maybe attend, that you're getting filled in, and now you're working at it. So all those sorts of things. But I guess we could kind of start this out by maybe Chris, let's ask you this. What were some of your big takeaways from this section of First Timothy that Eric kind of taught on last week?
Yeah, it's good. So I think there's the idea of deacons is something that, you know, I've thought about a lot. We've talked about a lot as leaders at Fathom, because we don't have official deacons. Mm-hmm. And so I liked Eric's take on this, of the way that deacons really kind of work out at Fathom is that it's our staff, and it's also some of our more discipling focused volunteers. Mm-hmm. And so just like with eldership, there are paid elders, there are staff elders, and there are lay elders. I think that translates down into deacons, is that we have paid, essentially, deacons. Mm-hmm. We call them staff or ministers or whatever. And then we have unpaid deacons that might be more like group leaders, or, you know, some team leaders within volunteer teams, things like that function as, even though we don't have the title of deacon, we don't have a formal diaconate, they function as deacons. And so as I was thinking then about that, listening to Eric preach, I just thought it'd be real helpful for the three of us to talk and kind of represent the paid deacons, the paid staff of this church, to really, I don't know, like most of our church will never be paid by their church. Most of our church will never be staff members of a church. They might become a volunteer deacon, or, you know, in some way, or even a volunteer elder. But there is a difference. And I just thought it would behoove us to have that conversation and think through the differences, so that, one, people could kind of get an insight into what we do, but then two, they might hear from us some of the challenges, some of the benefits, and even some of the ways they might better support the staff of their church. I just know that no church staff member gets into this because it's a big lucrative career. None of us are getting rich off of this. None of us were thinking, you know what this is going to do is set me up like a fat cat for retirement. Like, none of you get into ministry like this because you feel called into ministry like this. And so just let's get a window into it and a light on it, what it might look like to be a paid staff or deacon kind of role in a church. So that's what I was thinking about when I was listening to Eric preach on this. And I just thought this would be a good chance for us to talk about this a little deeper.
Yeah. So I guess one place where we can start is what happened when we went from, you know, being at a church to moving to a staff. Now, staff position, now that might not have been, I mean, that wasn't really me here at this church, but Karina, I want to ask you, what was it kind of like going from being in a member at Fathom Church to becoming a staff, to becoming a staff member here, having a role on the staff here? What were like the good things, the bad things, the struggles, the joys, that kind of stuff for you?
Yeah, I think interestingly enough, I don't think I was looking to be on church staff. It's kind of just what God put in front of me in the path that was laid out. And so I don't think I had put much thought into it ahead of time, but it was a very interesting. I mean, I grew up in the church. I'm a pastor's kid, so I don't know why this was so shocking to me, but I was very surprised at how the shift from like just going to church and then working at church, that it felt very much like work. Oh, like I work here now, and it's
Mm-hmm.
not just a place where I go to worship. It's like I'm showing up
Mhm.
and working.
Yeah.
And it just kind of changed how the Sunday morning, like I am not in service for the first two songs. So it's just been adjusting to like, hey, how do I prep myself for I'm not in the service prepping myself. Like, what does that look like? So that's been an adjustment. Just kind of interactions with people in the church. I mean, you're now on staff, and so people either think you're in the know or they're like you're in leadership, and so there's definitely a shift in that. But also, something that Eric said that really stuck out to me, when selfless Christ-like service is seen, it may encourage others to serve. And I've just experienced that, just being able to serve and then having people who are willing to come serve alongside me has been really rewarding.
Mm.
That's good.
Yeah, Kyle. I mean, so we can get to my bit because,
Sure.
but I wasn't saved for long
Mhm.
before I started working vocationally in the church. So my story is a little different. So let's come back to me. I'd love to hear from you because
Yeah.
you too were raised in the church,
Mhm.
and then you became an intern at the church that you were raised in,
Mhm.
and then you went to seminary and got a job in another church. So like talk through that transition for you.
Yeah, it was, I like church has been most of my whole life. I vocationally, like I've worked a few other jobs that were not in ministry. And so, and we can maybe talk about those in a little bit, but yeah, it's definitely different when you go from, being a regular attender at your church to stepping into a different role. It's where I was at, I was young enough that it didn't affect me too much when I became like an intern with the youth ministry at my church that I grew up in. And I was like, that had been like through college and everything like that too. So I was still young enough. But yeah, it's one thing that I notice is that you do get treated differently. It's almost like your own mindset has to change a little bit. That this isn't necessarily just the place that you go and worship now. Like it's your work now. Like you have a job to do. You're like being in ministry sometimes, especially at my age back then, it's like you're kind of doing a lot of different things. And so it's a mindset change of like, hey, this is my place of worship, but now this is where God has called me to be, and he has called me to be at this church at this time. And that kind of goes into like I have a lot of great things about working at the church that you attend and everything like that. And then there's also like some difficult things that I just always continue to wrestle with. But yeah, and we'll get to that in a little bit too. But yeah, so it's a little different for me having grown up in the church since I was little, and then coming here to Fathom, coming here for a job, for a role, because I knew you, Chris, and not attending Fathom before having a job here, kind of jumping into a church, being on staff is a little different because you're already looked at as you're a staff member, and then kind of integrating your family into that too is like it's difficult in some ways because they didn't know the church, and it's just like, hey, this is new to all of us, and this is not just going to be my job. This is hopefully our place of worship and a place that we actually get fed. And again, I've said this on this podcast before that like I've been in churches where I have worked at that I didn't get that from my family. And again, that's a huge positive and huge joy from being here and working at a church that you can be fed and your family can be fed too. So yeah, so it's a little different being raised in the church and kind of working at a church for most of my life. But
yeah, and it's a strange thing. coming at it from different angles. So like, Karina, this was your church, and then it became your job.
Mm-hmm.
So in some ways has that, I don't know if this is the right question. We'll see if this is the right question. Can it still be your church?
Mm. Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, I'm kind of what Kyle was speaking about the family. My family had already, this was our church.
Right.
So it wasn't just me, but it's like my husband was plugged in and my kids were plugged in,
Yep.
and they would say, this is our church. And so that is a huge blessing to be at a church and then become staff, because you feel you don't have to do the work of like, or worry about your family. Like, are they going to find a place here? Right. So no, for me personally, that was a huge blessing to be able to step into that. And I don't know, like, I don't know what my kids think about me being on staff. I think on one side, it's kind of like, oh, that's cool. But then also like, well, this is still just my church. So.
Right.
See, and I was like literally the opposite of that. With my first church, it was like job first, because it was my first real job in ministry. And then it was like family. Now at that time I was like just getting married, and then Austin came into the picture a little bit later, but it was like, okay, this is almost like job and ministry first. Now family, here's our church. And hopefully this works out in growing us. And yeah, so kind of like the opposite of Karina.
Yeah. So those are interesting insights into this, because I've done both. That's not true. I found jobs and then I started a church. So mine's a little different. Like you start your own is kind of like, well, right. You know, but most of my life since becoming a Christian, it's been almost all vocational ministry. Knowing pretty quickly after I converted to Christianity that was what I wanted to do. So looking at church as a job and as a church is tricky, because I've been in churches where, if I'm honest, I was there because it was a job and it was experience and it was good ministry, but it wasn't the church I would choose. And then I've been in churches that it was a job and it was experience, and it became the church that over time, my family and I integrated in there, and it became our church. And then we started this church, and this was more like kind of, Karina, your situation, where it was like, we're building the church that we want to be in. And so in some ways it was like we found the church and it also happened to pay, it was like the best of both worlds. But that's not always the case. I mean, sometimes if you're a vocational minister, you got to be paid. This is how you pay your bills in some ways. And so you got to get experience and you've got to get a paycheck, which that's just a tricky balance, because everybody else is at your church because it's their church.
Right.
So what does that do? Let's take a couple of categories here. How does that affect your worship? How does that affect your work-life balance? How does that affect relationships? And then if I come up with other ones, we'll come up with them. But let's take those three, okay? Yep. Let's take worship, work-life balance, and relationships. And we'll just throw those up, and whoever wants to take them, you don't have to take them in that order or whatever, but like, let's talk about those things. As soon as you're on staff, how do those things change?
Oh, I'll jump in on this. I'll jump in on this. Worship first. That has always been a struggle for me, in the sense of really in my heart and in my head, almost like in a sense of like, the most as long as I've been working at a church, I've tried to separate these two things of, this is my job, and then I've got to be fed in some way. I've got to worship. I've still got to grow deeper in my relationship with God. And sometimes that's hard. Sometimes that's a very hard thing for me to do, because I get, so like we're busy. We're always doing, I always talk to people about like, someone who is in ministry and their schedule, and how it's not usually a 9 to 5, 5 days a week job. It's like all weird hours. I mean, when you're doing youth ministry, you're doing like Wednesday night stuff, and then you have retreats, and like mission trips and that kind of stuff. So it's very different. And there's some times where I get into that mode of like only work and only ministry work and only like doing things for the Lord, for his people. And to be honest, sometimes my personal relationship with God and my worship, and like me and my wife's, like sometimes that takes a hit a little bit of like, oh man, when was like I haven't been in church in a little bit. And we've like talked about this on, like working on a Sunday morning is busy and it's crazy. And sometimes your own personal worship can become almost just like my excuse is usually like, oh, well, I'm doing the Lord's work, and I keep going back to my time in seminary when I heard this a lot about seminary, that like I heard it a few times that somebody said, seminary sometimes could be like like some people's darkest times, or like when you're furthest away from the Lord because you're studying and studying and studying and you're growing and all this kind of stuff, and it's school stuff, but it's only that, and you don't like continue to work on yourself and your relationship with God. And sometimes that can become me on staff at a church where I'm like, man, I know I'm like always in the Bible and in the scriptures because I'm teaching youth and I'm writing curriculum for kids and stuff, but I always need to make sure I'm reminding myself that it's like I need to be fed too, and I still need to like go to service with my wife, and we need to, like grow together and closer to the Lord. So yeah, so worship sometimes gets hard in separating and realizing that, hey, I need to intentionally be like, the work that I'm doing is not for the most part, not my like personal growth. And I need to still do church. I think it's
important to designate at least a little bit between this is what I'm doing professionally. And this is what I'm doing individually or personally. Yeah. Right. And I'm not the guy who says, well, if you were studying for a youth sermon, that's not devotional. Like I think it can be. But I do think there's this distinction where you can replace loving God with serving God real quick.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a good distinction to make. Karina, what about the other two? What about work-life balance or relationships? Take one of those and fly on it.
Yeah, I think the work-life balance is really interesting because it's like you kind of subconsciously like, is this work? Or like, I'm just living my life, but this is ministry. Like, it's just a really weird line because we are Christians. Like all of us are Christians, not just staff. And so in a lot of ways, what we do is what the Christian does. But then on one hand, we get paid for what we do. So it's kind of like, oh, is this work or is this just me living out my faith? It's a very weird thing to have to question that. And I think that might be more in like the modern world, like where we get a paycheck and we're like tracking hours. So for me, that's always really a weird phenomena.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's like, am I working right now? Or is it like, would I be doing this if I wasn't paid? It's like, yeah, I'd do some of this, probably not all of this. The distinction I think that I make is we're being paid to equip people to do stuff, and we're being paid to be available and regular in those ways. Right? It's almost like taking a super volunteer and just kind of taking it to that next level to say, hey, you're being paid because you have gifting, because you have calling, but also because you're saying I'm committed to this at a deeper level. So I know Eric said in a sermon that like the staff, we were the big movers and shakers in moving the church facility this summer. And it's because we're paid to do that. Right. Like that's true. We did a lot, and we did that because that's our job. I mean, it's what we get paid to do. So yeah, I get that. I'll take the relationships thing because I think it's weird. And I would imagine, well, I've been in different roles. It gets weirder as you get deeper into it. Just FYI, like lead pastor is different than youth pastor is different than, 10 part-time is like, it just gets weirder. But I think across the board for staff, relationships do change. And it's just something to acknowledge. It doesn't mean that you can't have friends and deep, meaningful Christian relationships in the church if you're a staff member. But you would be wise to recognize the different hats that you wear in those relationships. Right? I mean, I just think that's part of it. Now, this happens on a volunteer level too. So if you're a D group leader, you're the leader of that group. Yeah. you are friends with the people in your group, but you're also charged with leading that group.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a power dynamic there that you need to acknowledge and just recognize. Doesn't mean you have to be, the stuffy leader and not be a friend and fun around the other people, but to your own detriment, you will undercut your leadership if you don't recognize and lead.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yep.
And the same then progresses into staff roles. Can you be friends with members of your church?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think so. Can you be vulnerable with members of your church? Yeah, I think so. Can you confess and repent of sin to members of your church? Yeah, I think so. And you have to recognize that you wear a different hat, right? So I think it's really important that you have people inside the church that you are in relationship with, that you have friends with, that you have accountability with, and probably that you have friends and accountability and relationships with people who are outside of the church. Because Kyle, you're the family pastor here no matter what, right? And so there is a level of accountability in that role that just is a power dynamic that you have to adhere to and understand.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm good friends with Kevin, with your husband. I think he's genuinely a good friend of mine, and I'm his pastor.
Mm-hmm.
And we got to acknowledge that.
Mm-hmm.
So he and I can go out and see a movie and eat a burrito and have a great time, and I'm still his pastor, which is just a strange thing. And I think I've said this in sermons, using him as an example, because here's the illustration. He is also a police officer.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I get in my car and I start driving, and if he is in his police cruiser and he's in uniform, he has a different power dynamic relationship with me in that case, because we're friends, but his police officering,
Sure,
whatever, his policing trumps our friendship in that moment.
right.
Mm-hmm.
He can't get me off the hook, as it were, because that would actually violate that power dynamic and that responsibility.
Yeah.
And the same is true for if he confesses something to me that would be cause for church discipline, just because we're buddies doesn't mean I don't get to push forward in that as an elder and a pastor of this church. So I think that's a helpful illustration to just say, we got to be cognizant of those different dynamics in relationships and have relationships inside the church. Yes. I know some pastors, ministers, deacons, elders who just kind of put up a brick wall. And I think that's problematic too, because I think you're a part of you're a sheep, even as you're a shepherd in the church. But to just knock that wall down and pretend like it didn't exist, pretend like there's no power dynamic there's no conflict of interest at some level, can bite you. I've been bit there too, where at some level you have to wear the hat that has been given to you.
Right.
So it's a weird thing though. It's certainly a weird thing. Hey, how many, let me ask this. One of the things I think about this often, Karina, you had told me before you came on staff, you, Kevin, and I were at lunch, and you said, you asked my forgiveness for not praying for me as your pastor, like not doing that as a member of the church. And I just felt really honored by that conversation, that you would say, I think I've done you wrong by not supporting you the way that a staff member or a pastor or an elder or shepherd at my church should be supported. I wonder, as now that you're on the other side and you're on staff, what would you want members of the church to know about what a paid vocational minister or deacon needs from a member of the church?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I remember that. And I do remember feeling really weighted about not praying for leadership. And I think now that I am on this side, I really feel that like I'm still human. I'm still prone to spiritual attacks, just to like sinful nature. And so I think a lot of times we do underestimate prayer, which is why I think I wasn't committed to praying for church leadership. I kind of feel that sometimes with like country leadership, whatever.
Yeah.
But prayer is powerful and it really guards against all kinds of things. And I think if people do pray seriously for us, that goes a long way. But also just like reaching out and checking in. Like as leaders, we do reach out to the people that we lead. And sometimes, you said the relationship is different, but hey, how are you doing? Like, how can I pray for you? Or like, hey, I'd love to grab coffee and just hear how things are going. I think those are things I miss just on like you know, still understanding that the dynamic, but just having the chance to like share what's on my heart also.
Yeah, that's good. What about you, Kyle? What
I
are you
would say
thinking now?
yes and amen to all of that. Yeah, I mean, it sounds so easy, but prayer. I mean, like one way that I think always that like our membership, the people who come to Fathom, what they could do for me and for our staff is pray for us. Like always be praying for us. And yeah, it sounds so silly and simple, but it's and let us know that you're praying for us too. Like Karina said, even just ask us how we're doing, how are things going, like how's the family doing, everything like that. What can I pray for you? Some of those meaningful, even just little conversations I've had with people, or even like text messages during the week, are those that I even get from the people, like being an elder that I shepherd, the people that I'm shepherding as an elder, even getting them just saying little things to me about, well, how can I pray for you? Like, how's your family doing? What can we do for? And it's just like that means so much, because it is like, yeah, we put a lot, like we pour a lot into the people of this church, and which is awesome, and it feels really good when people are like, hey, well, let me pray for you, let me pray, and it just makes me feel like they've got your back. Like the power of prayers, prayer is so powerful. And so yeah, I seriously would just be like, just keep praying for us, like asking how we're doing, ask how my family's doing, pray for my family, and just always like keep us on your prayer list, because we're doing a bunch, and sometimes we forget to ask for prayers and all that other kind of stuff for us too. So yeah, prayer is always huge.
Yeah, I think you guys are right. And I think acknowledging, Karina, you said that we're human, like we're part of this too. I think that's it's part of our story as a church, just kind of marking our story as a church, but also just this recognition that that we are all works in progress, that we need grace, that we need care, like we need people to pursue us. We need friends. Like we need to be treated like one of the guys or one of the gals. Like we just, we need times when we're just being goofy and silly, and not, always in every conversation talking about the church. Creating those sorts of environments I think are huge. But then there's also like, I mean, even as you guys are saying this, and like as I'm thinking about, like, there's also in the back of my head this like sneaking suspicion at times that I have to work through, is like, are they trying to get something from me? Are they like, I mean, there's some weird stuff too, that it's like, I would just say to our church, like, make sure that you're being genuine in this with us. Like you don't have to put on a facade for us. Right. You don't have to try and, earn some sort of favor with us. Yeah. Even with our families, right? Like treat our families normal, right? Yes. Like our kids, our spouses, like treat them like regular human beings too. That's something that Marcy has told me, is that, there's a lot of women who want to know her, and I think that's great, but she's not me. Like she doesn't have, she's not an extrovert. She doesn't have nearly the relational bandwidth that I have. And so there's pieces of that, like knowing her, knowing boundaries, knowing good, everybody in this whole church knows Harper. Because I talk about her, probably not for much longer, because she's starting to become aware of that. But like, but she doesn't know everybody. Yeah. Like, is she treated like a regular kid, or is she treated like some sort of special version of children here? So all of these things, I think, oh man, these are heavier things. These are hard things to work through. So, but I too think that I'm thankful for, that I have some genuine friendships in this church, like people who I'm like, yeah, we would probably be friends if this thing blew up tomorrow. We'd probably still be friends and pursue that friendship. And when you have that as a staff member, it's like worth its weight in gold, because you know that that's not always the case.
Yep. Right. Okay. As we're wrapping this up, just really quickly, What's one of the joys about working for your church, Karina?
One of the joys of working for the church is getting to just to serve in a way that I know God has equipped me. Missions has always been part of my story, and so to be able to do it in the context of my local church, it's super exciting to just see how that has been like orchestrated and worked together. And so, just getting to do what I love to do is a huge joy.
Chris,
Me?
Yeah. What's one of the joys?
Oh gosh.
I
mean,
one.
I love
Only one.
I love working for the church.
Yeah.
I mean, so I'm not the it's so hard, woe is me, pastor. Like I love this gig. Like I would love like this is what I love to do. I'm not doing this because I can't do anything else. By the way, I could do a lot of other cred. I'm super good at junk. Okay. JK. Okay. But
super humble too.
But yeah. But I mean, listen, I've got a college degree.
Yeah.
Like I'm a capable human being. I could very legitimately be doing something else. I'm not that guy who's like, oh, I couldn't imagine doing anything else. Like I could do a lot of stuff. But this is what I feel like I'm built for.
Yeah.
So I think that's echoing what you were saying, like realizing that this is the unique gifting that God has on your life and that you get to use it in the church is a delight. I also think that a joy, it can be a pitfall, like you were talking about earlier, Kyle, but this is also the flip side is a joy. It's a joy for me that I get to open God's word and study it for like a good chunk of the week. And I'm trying to figure out how to communicate it to people, but it's also nourishing and edifying my heart as I get to do that. So I still do my quiet time in the morning with the Lord and I'm reading my scriptures with our reading plan and doing all that stuff. But then I get to walk into my office and it's like, what's next in the text? Right. And it's like, okay, women in ministry, how am I going to handle this? You know, like, and the stress and then the wrestle and then the reading and the study and the writing and like all of that just, I mean, I just get jazzed on that. So the delight for me is that I feel like I grow deep with Jesus as I do my job too. So it can be a pitfall, but it can also be a big lifter.
Yeah. And I mean, part of that kind of goes along with one of my biggest joys. And I know I talked about sometimes it's hard to separate things but one of my biggest joys at working in a church is that, I mean, your work is at the place where you worship God and where you get to be with God's people and be in community and especially the joys about being with this church, with Fathom Church. And like I alluded to this earlier that it's like I love having my family here so much because you said it earlier, Chris, that that this is a church that I would choose to go to if I didn't work here. If I stopped being on staff next week or whatever like that, I would, Lord willing, I would still show up and attend this church. If I had a different job doing something else that wasn't in ministry, I would absolutely love to be here with these people worshiping God like the way we do it here. It's great. And seriously, especially having my family be a part of this, like when we started here and I brought my family here, it was like just how they're being filled at like kids level, my wife and the friendships that she has and everything like that. It's awesome. So I do love, there's so many joys about working in a church and especially working for this church and with God's people. So
yeah, it's a gift for sure.
It is.
Love it.
It is. Well, that's all the time we got. Thank you guys for this discussion. Yeah, church, keep praying for us. We love you. And we'll catch you next time.